Sir.
Hi, I'm Dan Rink, the futurist. Is this on?
Yes.
I'm Dan Rink, the futurist. We've been talking about the physical book, but let's talk a little bit more about the book as a coherent body of knowledge, thought, a dialogue with readers over time around a particular topic, and the relationship between that notion of a book and public policy or public opinion. And that seems to be almost non-existent, that relationship. And if we think of the current medical care debate in this country, one could probably come in any library or bookstore and find 5 books that really spell out all of the issues, all of the things we need to think about, what we need to do. And yet, it would appear that none of those have any impact whatsoever on the public policy that's going to result. So what about the book as a coherent body of thought that's applied to public policy?
Anyone?
I think that the trajectory of decline for the book in that role of the catalyst for public debate predates the internet and actually goes back to the rise of television. So if you look back at the 50s and the 60s, from that point forward, I think you find that public opinion was being formed more and more by people basing their decisions on what they heard on a newscast versus what they were reading. I don't know, you could maybe go back earlier than that. But today, the environment today is actually a really much more complex ecology where the people writing books on policy are being read, and they're being read often by the political bloggers, they're being read by the insider political journalists, and some of those are using those books to frame their questions, to frame their stories. You can also kind of tune in to that a little more directly on in a few more mainstream outlets like Terry Gross's interviews, and you can subscribe to magazines that still participate in that debate. And what happens is that debate gets boiled down to a 15 or 30-second soundbite for use on the cable news channels. And that's where, and those sound bites then are amplified often by the partisan warfare on the web. So you have this kind of really complicated informational system in which those policy books are involved, but they're not. They're often being their messages are coming through in a sort of corrupted way because they're being used for political purposes. And I'm not sure there's any solution to that technology can provide that I can think of. If I could think of it, I'd be out there trying to make it.
I'd like to respond to this gentleman. I mean, isn't it a point of fact? I mean, even the question that you just posed, that high tech, and the way you framed the question is an effort to wrest the text out of the physical body of the book and transpose it to some other realm. And isn't it a fact as well that high tech is a culture entirely predicated, and I'll put this also to Scott, entirely predicated upon the idea of obsolescence. It's not a culture that begets, it's a culture that deletes. It's a culture that has obsolescence inbuilt in it. It's a culture that destroys tradition. It's a culture that violates the idea of the sacred. There's nothing sacred about anything in high tech. What about that? I mean, what about the fact that the book is a sacred object and that it is high tech's objective to destroy that physical object? I mean, isn't that clear? Isn't it clear that high tech?
I just want to say before I hand this off to Scott, I just want to say one thing. If anybody here is crazy about Pulp Fiction from the 1930s, like I am, you know the book is not a sacred object.
So obsolescence.
I'm not sure I understand that, but I'd like to hear from Scott and then from the audience.
I'll try to make this quick. The machinery of technology is a machine of obsolescence, so that your laptop this year, in 5 years, is obsolete. But the information that the internet is collecting today is actually mostly immortal. At this point, for instance, I wrote this book that's a history of blogging. Many of the blogs that I wanted to write about from 10, 15 years ago are no longer online, but they're findable. They are archived. Once something is put in digital form, it's almost impossible to erase it. Now, in fact, this causes some public policy issues, some problems, some concerns about privacy that you've alluded to. But the deletion nightmare that all of us as computer users have had, where something is on our desktop and our Word crashes and we lose our document and we go, oh my God, how can I ever recover those paragraphs? That's a transitory thing. The future of this kind of technology is much more in the permanence of the stuff we're creating. And as a writer, I'm thrilled. The first part of my writing career is gone. It's buried in the archives of the Boston Phoenix and the San Francisco Examiner on pieces of paper that someday will burn. But the blogging I've done and the writing I've done online, I'm convinced my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren will be able to read it. Now, under what circumstances and what the businesses and the legal environment around that, that's what we're trying to work out today, and we want that to be done right. But the writing will be there.
Sorry.
So when you Google S&M.com, that's going to be forever?
Well, but
That's immortal now.
I
mean, that's
must
the
say
idea.
that seems like a utopian view, because that was the reason why archive for newspapers, that was the belief, is that you could always go into the basement of the San Francisco Chronicle and find, on whatever the format became, the old copy, and then in fact it would always be there, and that is why libraries were built for immortality. And the truth of the matter is that you can find a whole lot of things, but you can't find everything. And so I certainly hope, for the sake of your children and grandchildren, that they can read it forever. But I don't think we should assume that, because there were many things, for instance, that I saved on early computers in early formats, that it would be possible to go into a laboratory with my old floppy disks and possibly retrieve all that information, and it wasn't that long ago. So I do think that it's a utopian view to say it will always be there because it was there last you checked. I mean, that it's the very idea of loss comes from the idea that if you just go back and check, you'll find it again. So I'm neither as pessimistic as Mr. Kaufman that the sacred object is constantly being destroyed, but neither do I think, oh, don't worry, all of our sacred objects are going to be kept in a mighty database for everyone to look at. Assuming, of course, that anyone would be interested.
Now,